The year was 1945. Germany had fallen silent, not in peace, but in defeat. The thunder of artillery had ceased, and in its place lingered the hum of distant trucks, the low murmur of soldiers, and the quiet hunger that crept through every broken street. In the ruins of Europe's greatest war, human pride lay shattered, and hunger became the one language everyone understood. On the outskirts of a small American-controlled town in Bavaria, the air was heavy with the scent of something almost forgotten. Food. Not the scraps and boiled weeds that had kept people alive during the last months of the war, but real food. Steaming pots of stew, fresh bread, and thick slices of meat sizzling under the open sky. A group of German women, thin and pale from months of rationing and loss, stood uncertainly at the edge of the field. They were prisoners now, former enemies, wives and daughters of soldiers who had marched under the swastika, and across from them the Americans, young, clean, shaven, and impossibly well-fed, were setting up tables and calling out in friendly English tones, "Eat, there's plenty." The women exchanged glances. The absurdity of it, being offered food by the very men they had been told were monsters, was too much. They burst into laughter, not cruel laughter, but the kind born of disbelief, of exhaustion, of realizing that the war had truly ended. What followed that laughter became one of the most human moments of the post-war years. A meal shared between conqueror and conquered, and the strange kindness that comes when the guns finally fall silent. The first days after Germany's surrender in May of 1945 were unlike anything Europe had ever seen. The sound of gunfire had faded, but what replaced it was a silence that felt heavier than war itself. A silence made of hunger, smoke, and disbelief. Cities were piles of broken stone. Villages were hollow shells. And the people were ghosts of who they used to be. The roads that once carried tanks now carried refugees. Endless lines of them, moving slowly through mud and ash. Among them were women, mothers clutching their children, widows in black scarves, and young girls who had never known a world without war. Every step was weighed down by fatigue. Every face was pale with hunger. For them, surrender was not an ending. It was the beginning of survival. On one grey afternoon, a group of German women arrived at an American encampment near a captured Bavarian town. They were not soldiers, not anymore. Their husbands were gone, some missing, some dead, and the uniforms they once washed and ironed were now meaningless rags. Their shoes were worn thin, their hands cracked from cold and work, and yet, even in defeat, there was a strange stiffness in the way they stood, the last remnants of pride that refused to crumble completely. Across from them, American soldiers were unloading trucks. Big olive green machines rumbled across the wet ground, carrying supplies that seemed to come from another world entirely. Crates stamped with U.S. Army, filled with canned food, bread, coffee, and things that smelled impossibly rich. The air carried the scent of something the German women hadn't smelled in months, meat cooking over fire. At first, they didn't approach. They stood near a broken fence, their eyes fixed on the soldiers in disbelief. These were the men they had been told were savages, destroyers, the same men who had bombed their cities, who now stood calm and almost casual, laughing and joking as they stirred large pots over open flames. The smell of the food wafted across the field, cutting through the stench of mud and diesel. One of the women, no older than 20, whispered something under her breath, a comment half in scorn, half in longing. Another laughed bitterly. "They're eating like kings," she muttered. The others nodded, too proud to admit how the smell twisted something deep inside their stomachs. But the Americans noticed. One of them, tall, broad-shouldered, with his helmet tilted back, turned toward them. He hesitated, glancing at his fellow soldiers. Then, with a shrug, he picked up a ladle and motioned toward the women. He didn't know their language, but his gesture was unmistakable, "Come eat." The women froze. The moment hung in the air like smoke. None of them moved. Hunger pushed them forward, but pride held them back. These men were the enemy. Only a few weeks earlier, German propaganda had painted them as beasts, men without mercy, and yet here they stood, offering food freely, without shouting, without mockery. The youngest among them, the same one who had whispered before, stepped forward first. Her name was Elsa. Her stomach felt like it was folding in on itself. She took one step, then another. The others watched her closely, their faces unreadable. When she reached the soldier, she stopped short, unsure of what to say. He smiled awkwardly. "Eat," he said slowly, his voice gentle but firm. "There's plenty." She didn't understand the words, not all of them, but the tone was unmistakable. She nodded slightly, eyes darting toward the pot. The smell was intoxicating. The soldier handed her a tin bowl filled with something thick and steaming. Elsa hesitated only a moment before taking it. The warmth seeped into her cold fingers. She looked down into the bowl, chunks of meat, vegetables, real broth. Her mind couldn't reconcile it. Only weeks ago, she had been boiling nettles and scraping crumbs from the bottom of drawers. Now, the enemy was giving her food that smelled like home. The other women watched in silence. Some were whispering. Some were crying quietly, not even sure why. Then another woman stepped forward. Then another slowly. The line began to form, hesitant, disbelieving. The Americans, seeing this, began to serve without question. There was no triumph in their gestures, no arrogance. They were young men far from home, and they had seen enough of war to know that mercy didn't make you weak. But still, the hesitation lingered. For the German women, each step toward that pot was a step away from everything they had been told to believe. They were the wives, sisters, and daughters of soldiers who had promised them a 1,000-year empire. Now, that empire was ash, and the hands feeding them were those of the so-called enemy. Pride is a stubborn thing. It doesn't vanish with surrender, it lingers like smoke after a fire. Some of the women could barely meet the Americans' eyes as they took their bowls. A few whispered, "Denki." Under their breath, "Thank you," the word trembling as though it carried shame. For a moment no one spoke. Only the sound of ladles scraping metal and the soft crackle of the fire filled the air. The smell of stew mixed with the scent of earth and diesel, and it felt surreal, like a dream that shouldn't exist in this world of ruins. Then, in that fragile silence, a strange thing happened. One of the women, an older one with silver hair and a deep scar across her cheek, began to laugh. It wasn't mocking or cruel. It was the laughter of someone who couldn't quite believe what was happening. She looked at her bowl, at the American who had handed it to her, and laughed again, shaking her head. The others turned to her, startled. Then, slowly, the laughter spread. First a chuckle, then another, until a ripple of laughter ran through the group. It wasn't joy. It was release. Months of fear, hunger, and despair broke in that sound. They laughed at the absurdity of it all, at the idea of plenty, at the strange kindness of strangers, at their own helplessness in the face of hunger. The Americans didn't understand the words, but they understood the sound. Some of them laughed softly too, though they didn't know why. They just knew it wasn't the laughter of defiance, but of something finally breaking free. Elsa ate slowly, tears running down her cheeks. Every bite tasted of warmth and salt and memory. Around her others did the same, eating quietly, reverently, as though afraid the moment would vanish if they blinked. That afternoon stretched long into the grey evening. When the last bowls were emptied and the fires began to fade, the women lingered, not wanting to leave. The Americans gave them coffee, black, bitter, and rich, and they drank it as if it were sacred. As the sun dipped behind the broken horizon, the field was quiet again. Only the smell of food remained, mingling with the damp air. The women stood together, their bellies full for the first time in months, their hearts still unsure what to feel. One of the soldiers, as he cleaned his ladle, looked up at the women and then at the distant sky. He didn't know their names, their stories, or their losses. But in that brief, wordless exchange, food for dignity, kindness for laughter, he saw something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. War had stripped them all of something, but that day, in that ruined field, a small piece of humanity returned. The women walked back toward their camp as dusk fell, their footsteps slow but lighter than before. Behind them, the Americans packed away their supplies. The war was over, but its echoes would last forever. Yet for a few hours, amid the ashes and hunger, people who had been enemies shared something simple: a meal, a laugh, a fragile peace. And that was how, in the first days of a broken peace, the words, "Eat, there's plenty," became something more than a command. They became a symbol of the quiet, awkward mercy that sometimes follows even the darkest of wars. When the tall American soldier said those words, "Eat, there's plenty," the sound seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. His English was calm, simple, and unassuming, but to the German women standing before him, it was almost alien. The syllables carried warmth, but also confusion. Plenty. That word had lost all meaning in Germany long ago. The women stood there unsure whether to laugh, cry, or walk away. For so long, food had been a weapon, rationed, fought over, stolen, and traded. And now the enemy, the supposed barbarian across the sea, was standing before them, offering it freely. It was absurd. It was impossible. The first laugh came from an older woman, a brittle, wheezing laugh that startled even her companions. She clutched her stomach and bent over, shaking her head as though the words had been a cruel joke. The Americans looked at each other, puzzled but smiling faintly. They didn't understand the language, but laughter, that they recognized. Then another laugh followed, then another. Within seconds, it spread like a spark through dry grass. The air, once heavy with suspicion and silence, filled with laughter, awkward, nervous, unstoppable. Some of the women were laughing through tears, their faces streaked with dirt and emotion. Others covered their mouths, as though ashamed of the sound escaping them. The Americans exchanged glances, unsure whether they were being mocked or thanked. One of them murmured, "Guess they think I'm funny." Another shrugged, his eyes softening. Let him laugh. Lord knows they need it. But for the women, it wasn't humor. It was release. For years, laughter had been dangerous. It had been forbidden in the presence of fear. They had learned to keep quiet, to survive in silence, in the shadows of soldiers, propaganda, and hunger. Now, suddenly, here they were, standing in front of the men they'd been taught to hate, and being told there was plenty. The absurdity was too great. The tension snapped, and all that was left was the laughter of disbelief. Elsa, the young woman who had taken the first bowl, couldn't stop smiling through her tears. She sat on a wooden crate, spoon in hand, staring at the stew like it was magic. Every bite brought warmth back into her fingers. Around her, the laughter faded into gentle murmurs, and soon the air filled with the sound of spoons tapping metal bowls, of chewing, of quiet gratitude that needed no words. An American sergeant stood by the fire, watching them with folded arms. He had seen battle. Normandy, the Ardennes, the Rhine. He had seen men scream, burn, and vanish. But this, watching women who had once been the enemy eat until they trembled, felt stranger than war. It was peace, but it wasn't simple. It was the kind of peace that carried guilt on both sides. One of the women, her face sunken but proud, looked up at him and pointed to her bowl. "Gut," she said softly, then again louder. "Sehr gut." The sergeant smiled. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. He nodded. "Good," he repeated, tapping his chest. "Good." A few soldiers began to sit down with them, sharing small smiles and pieces of bread. The initial wall of caution began to crumble, replaced by an awkward kind of humanity. The soldiers weren't heroes here. They were young men trying to do something decent in a world that had shown them too much indecency. And the women weren't enemies. They were survivors, thin shadows of what the war had left behind. For a while, there was no language, only gestures. A shared piece of bread, a smile, a nod. One soldier even pulled out a small harmonica and played a slow, trembling tune that drifted through the air like smoke. The melody was unfamiliar to the Germans, but it was soft, almost like a lullaby. A few of the women smiled again, their laughter now quieter, their faces warmer. The laughter had broken the ice, but what came after was deeper, a fragile understanding that the war was truly over. For years, both sides had been told the other was monstrous beyond forgiveness. But hunger strips away illusion, and laughter, even tired, desperate laughter, makes enemies human again. When the meal ended, some of the women lingered near the fire. They were hesitant to leave, perhaps afraid that walking away would end the moment, that the cold would return, not just to their bodies, but to the world itself. The Americans kept the fires burning, ladling more stew into empty bowls, refilling them again without being asked. No one wanted to say goodbye. The soldier who had spoken first, the one whose words had sparked that laughter, crouched near the pot, stirring slowly. He looked up at the women and gave a small grin. "Plenty," he said again, tapping the ladle. Then, pointing to their bowls, "Eat." They laughed again, softer this time. A few repeated the word, testing it on their tongues, "Plenty." Their accents bent it, softened it, made it sound fragile, almost poetic. It became a word of peace, a word that meant safety after years of scarcity. Behind the women, the ruins of the town stretched into the distance. Collapsed roofs, shattered windows, and the black skeletons of what had once been homes. The smell of smoke and wet earth still lingered, a reminder of the war that had just ended. But near the fire, for the first time in years, there was warmth, laughter, and the taste of real food. Elsa looked at the soldiers and wondered how many of them had lost people too. Brothers, fathers, friends. War had taken from everyone. Maybe the difference between enemy and ally was smaller than anyone had wanted to admit. Maybe kindness, even awkward and wordless kindness, was the only way to live again. When night began to fall, one of the soldiers pulled out a pack of cigarettes and offered it to the women. Some refused politely, others took one and held it like a souvenir. The flames flickered, and shadows danced across their faces, faces that had been hardened by years of fear, now softened by food, laughter, and the quiet realization that tomorrow might actually come. A woman in her 40s, with sharp cheekbones and tired eyes, looked up at the soldier beside her and pointed to the stew pot. "You cook?" she asked in broken English. He laughed, shaking his head. "No, ma'am. Army cook." He pointed toward the man stirring the next pot, a broad, cheerful figure with an apron over his uniform. The woman smiled faintly and mimed applause. The soldier grinned, the cook gave an exaggerated bow, and the women laughed again. It wasn't much, but in that laughter, something deep was healed. Later, as stars began to emerge in the bruised sky, the women helped wash the bowls in a nearby stream. The water was cold and clear, and their reflections shimmered between the ripples. One woman said quietly, "Maybe they are not what we thought." Another replied, "Maybe we are not what they think either." The sound of the harmonica carried faintly through the night, and in the distance, an American sentry whistled a tune. The world, for the first time in years, felt almost peaceful. By the time the women returned to their camp, the air had grown colder. They wrapped themselves in thin coats and sat together, whispering about the day, about the food, the laughter, the strange kindness of men they had feared. Some said it was a trick, others said it was mercy, but deep down, every one of them knew something had shifted. Laughter had broken the spell of hatred. Hunger had taught them humility. And kindness, unexpected, undeserved kindness, had reminded them that even after the worst of humanity, there could still be good left somewhere in it. The next morning, the women woke to the sound of trucks again. The Americans were moving to another location, farther east. The same soldier waved to them before climbing into the back of a vehicle. "Plenty." He shouted one last time, grinning. The women laughed again, this time without disbelief. They waved back, some calling after him in broken English, "Plenty! Plenty!" The trucks rolled away, leaving behind tracks in the muddy ground, and a memory that would stay with them long after the sound of engines faded. For many of those women, that moment, that laughter, that meal, became the first real proof that the war had ended. They had survived bombings, loss, and hunger. But what had truly marked the end of it all was not surrender or silence, but laughter shared with the enemy over a bowl of soup. It was the most fragile kind of peace, but it was peace nonetheless. When the laughter faded and the bowls were finally empty, a strange quiet settled over the field. The laughter had broken something open, released a pressure that had been building for years. Now only the sound of spoons scraping metal lingered, soft, rhythmic, almost peaceful. The fire crackled, sending thin threads of smoke into the cool Bavarian air, and for a moment, it felt as if the world had stopped turning. The women sat together on the ground, their backs straight but their shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. Their faces were pale, their hair tangled, their coats threadbare. But there was color returning to their cheeks, a faint warmth creeping into skin that had forgotten what comfort felt like. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The act of eating, of being allowed to eat without fear, without ration tickets or shame, said everything that needed saying. For the Americans, the scene felt almost surreal. Only a few months ago, they had fought their way through towns where these same people had cheered the enemy flag. They had seen the wreckage of what that flag had done. The camps, the wounded, the endless dead. Many of them had sworn they would never feel pity again. Yet here they were, handing bowls to women who could barely lift their arms, watching them eat like it was salvation itself. The young American who had said the words, "Eat, there's plenty," stood quietly by the fire, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He wasn't smiling now. There was a look on his face that none of his comrades could quite read. Maybe it was compassion, maybe guilt, or maybe just the dawning realization that war didn't end when the shooting stopped. It lingered, like hunger, long after victory was declared. A soft wind swept through the camp, carrying the mingled scents of smoke, stew, and damp earth. One of the women, Elsa, held her bowl close, eating slowly, savoring every bite. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from something deeper. She couldn't remember the last time she had eaten until she was full. Every bite felt unreal, like waking from a nightmare and realizing the world still existed. She looked up at the Americans. Young men not much older than her brothers had been when they left for the front. Some of them were joking quietly, others smoking, a few simply staring into the fire as if trying to make sense of it all. She wondered if they missed home, if their mothers were somewhere far away, thinking of them as she thought of her own lost family. The stew was gone too quickly. The women licked their spoons clean, embarrassed but unwilling to waste a single drop. One woman, older than the rest, sat with her eyes closed, as if committing the taste to memory. Another whispered a prayer under her breath, thanking a god she had nearly stopped believing in. And then something unexpected happened. One of the American soldiers, a dark-haired man with tired eyes, walked over and handed Elsa a small piece of bread wrapped in paper. "For later," he said simply. She stared at it, unsure if she should take it. He smiled and pressed it gently into her hands before turning away. She looked down at the bread, soft, white, unburnt. The kind of bread she hadn't seen in over a year. For a moment, long after that, duty called, even in peace. One by one, they returned to their posts, leaving the women huddled together near the dying embers. Elsa lay down on the cold ground, clutching her small piece of bread. Around her, the others slept or whispered quietly into the night. She thought about the word again, plenty. It was more than food. It was hope. It was the possibility that life, somehow, could be rebuilt. When dawn came, the fires were cold, and the soldiers were preparing to move on. The women awoke to the rumble of trucks and the clatter of metal. They stood at a distance, watching as the Americans packed up their camp. One of the soldiers waved, and a few of the women waved back. Then the young soldier, the one who had first spoken to them, looked over his shoulder and grinned. "Eat," he called out again, raising his voice over the roar of engines.
"There's plenty!"
The words carried across the field, bright and strange in the morning light. For a moment, the women were silent, and then, just as before, they began to laugh. The sound rolled across the ruined landscape like music, like something alive in a place that had known only death. The trucks moved off, leaving only dust and silence behind. The women stood together, still smiling, their eyes following the convoy until it vanished over the horizon. The laughter faded slowly, but the warmth it left behind remained. That night, when they returned to their own camp, the women spoke quietly of what had happened. They didn't use grand words. No one spoke of mercy or forgiveness. They just spoke of the food, the fire, and the strange kindness of men they had once feared. One woman said, "They fed us as if we were human." Another replied softly, "Perhaps we are again." Days later, when they were moved to another area, the story spread. Others heard about it, about the meal, the laughter, the words the American had said. "Eat, there's plenty." It became something of a legend among the prisoners and the civilians who had lost everything. Some dismissed it as rumor. Others swore they had been there themselves. But for those who had lived it, it was a memory carved deep into the heart, proof that she felt dizzy. That small piece of bread was more than food. It was proof that kindness could exist after everything had been taken. Around her, the other women were finishing their meals, some talking quietly now, their voices soft and human again. The tension that had hung between them and the Americans was gone. They were still enemies by history, but not by heart. Not anymore. The Americans began to clean up. Pots were emptied, ladles scraped, and dishes rinsed with cold water. One soldier picked up a harmonica and started playing, the same slow, wistful tune he'd played the day before. The melody drifted across the camp, rising and falling like breath. The women listened in silence, their eyes glinting in the firelight. Elsa held her bread and whispered the English word she'd heard so many times that day. Plenty. It sounded strange in her mouth, foreign yet gentle. She repeated it, as though saying it might make it true, might make the hunger stay away forever. The sergeant, the one who had been watching quietly, noticed her. He smiled faintly. "Plenty," he said again, nodding. She nodded back. And though neither understood the other's language, the meaning was clear. The night grew darker. The fires burned lower. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a silence that felt peaceful rather than empty. Some of the women began to hum softly, an old German lullaby that had survived the bombings, the fear, and the propaganda. The sound blended with the harmonica, two melodies from opposite worlds meeting somewhere in the middle. For a brief moment, it was as if the war had never happened. The Americans, tired from their own nightmares, leaned back against their jeeps listening. They didn't know the words, but the tune spoke to them all the same. It was about loss, about home, about wanting to return to something that no longer existed. And in that shared silence, something like understanding passed between them. The quiet recognition that everyone had lost something in this war. The older German woman who had laughed first looked up at the sky. The stars were faint, blurred by the smoke of the fires, but they were there, unbroken, eternal. She smiled softly, whispering to no one in particular, "Perhaps the world can begin again." No one heard her words, but somehow everyone felt them. As the fire dimmed, the Americans handed out blankets. A few of the women accepted them shyly, murmuring their thanks in broken English. The soldiers didn't stay long. Even after years of hatred and destruction, there could still be moments of decency. For years afterward, Elsa would remember that day whenever she smelled stew or bread. She would tell her children about the men in olive, green uniforms who spoke a language she barely understood, but whose kindness needed no translation. And every time she reached the part where he said, "Eat, there's plenty," she would smile softly, the same way she had that day, with disbelief and gratitude mingled together. The war had ended, but history had not. The scars of that time would last for generations. Yet buried among them were tiny moments like this, forgotten by books, unwritten in reports, but powerful in their quiet humanity, because wars may be fought by nations, but peace is built in moments like these. Over bowls of stew under grey skies, when laughter replaces gunfire. And so, when people later asked her what peace sounded like, Elsa never mentioned speeches or parades. She simply said, "It sounded like laughter, and it smelled like stew."